we're pleased to be sponsoring this event to bring attention to a new book, Making College Work by Harry Holzer and Sandy Baum. Sandy's a fellow at the Urban Institute and a professor emerita of economics at Skidmore College. Harry is a Lafarge SI, something I'm going to have
SJ.
SJ. Ah, okay, SJ. What is SJ?
Society of Jesus, Jesuits.
Ah, okay. So he's a Lafarge Jesuit professor at McCourt School of Public Policy, Georgetown. He's also a non-resident fellow here at Brookings. And both are distinguished students of post-secondary education with long record of study and publication, including wonderful documents about the price of college and tuition and so forth that Sandy has been doing for many years. After Harry and Sandy provide us with an overview of the book, my colleague Richard Reeves will try to stump them by asking amazingly penetrating questions and befuddling them. Then we're fortunate to have two reactants who are highly qualified to hold forth on how to improve post-secondary education. LaShawn Richburg Hayes, formerly a senior researcher at MDRC, now leads education work at the Insight Policy Research in Arlington. We'll also hear from David Boehm, Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Policy Analysis for the American Association of Community Colleges. After we hear from LaShawn and David, Richard will question again and moderate a discussion among all four speakers, hopefully lively and interesting. And then we'll give the audience a chance to ask questions of the speakers. So we're pleased to sponsor this event to announce an important book that has public policy implications. And this sort of thing is the bread and butter of our center at Brookings, to sponsor a discussion about a strikingly original book that proposes solutions to a major social problem faced by the nation. So with that, Harry and Sandy.
So for those of you who are fans of professional wrestling, Sandy and I are going to be a tag team on this. Go back and forth. No body slams or any of that, but so yeah.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. We're really excited to have the chance today to talk about the issues in our book, which focus on educational outcomes for disadvantaged students. And we're going to talk about what happens to students in college and after college. And we're very much focused on the students who come from low-income backgrounds, from first-generation students. That, of course, disproportionately includes a lot of Black and Hispanic students and a lot of older students. I want to say a couple of words about why we wrote this book. And I mean, if you think about the context of the conversation about college and the number of people who are asking if college is worth it, probably most people in this room agree college is very worth it, and it gets frustrating to listen to that conversation, but it's increasingly clear that the variation in outcomes is very significant. And in fact, the group on which we're focused has outcomes that are not nearly as satisfactory as the outcomes of those people you see on the front page of the New York Times who have a bachelor's degree and might work at Starbucks for 6 months. So we want to focus on these students and how can we make their lives better, both before college, during college, and after college. And so we decided that we should put our differing expertises together. Harry's a labor economist. He thinks a lot about the workforce. I'm a higher education economist. We actually met working on a project about Pell Grants, where he crossed the line over to my world, and we just became increasingly aware of how the intersection of these issues is important, and we need to talk to each other more. And the fruit of it is this book. And so we're talking about what the problems are, the problems that students don't go to college in enough numbers, they don't graduate. When they are there, they don't study the right things to get credentials of value. So we want to ask what causes these problems and what solutions might be most beneficial. And we're focused on lack of resources, both at the institutional level and the state level, on the incentives that students and institutions face, and on being realistic about what the options for what we can do within the context of higher education to solve these problems. And it's a challenge, and we want to grapple with some of the hard questions where we have to actually make choices about what is going to be best for these students. So we're going to talk about all of these problems a little bit, frame the problems a little bit, and then talk about solutions. And again, we focus on the students and the institutions, on the problems in both areas and on the solutions in both areas. And a big part of the problem, obviously, is financing and resources. And we're going to talk a little bit about student debt, but that's not a problem in isolation. It's a problem primarily because of students not successfully completing degrees of value in the labor market.
So of those three problems listed on the last slide, I'm going to just show you some numbers on the first two to convince you that there are problems there. So this is from a national survey of beginning college students, and we're looking at completion rates. And as you can see, there's the blue is completion of bachelor's degree, light blue is associate degrees, very, very light blue is certificates, and then the two groups of non-completers, one of whom is still enrolled, and the other is not enrolled. And we have four groups. This is only for dependent students still living with or on their family's income. They're roughly in quartiles. So the top quartile is the high group, bottom quartile is the lowest income group, and the numbers jump out at you. There's very, very different completion rates. Certainly of bachelor's degrees, very high gaps, and of anything, right? So the bottom group, 55%, after 6 years, have nothing to show, no credential of any kind. And the top group, that's only 30%. So the gaps are very wide by income. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, of course, these students bring very different characteristics, and there's big achievement gaps that we've heard a lot about. Even when you look within achievement group, like by GPA, we've sliced up the sample, you do see a pattern like this. The gaps are not quite as big once you control for achievement, but they're still there, and especially for the middle achievers, the gaps can be strikingly high. Well, Sandy said there's a lot of older students, we often call non-traditional students, going to college these days, often going back. So we have four different age groups here. Again, as the numbers go up, the ages get higher. This is not well known. Older students have much, much lower probabilities of completing relative to the bottom group, the group coming right out of high school. Now, this is definitely not based on achievement, because if you look at, for instance, grades in college, the older groups do as well or even slightly better than the younger groups. They're serious, they're focused. Other things in their lives, presumably, like working to support their families, are often keeping them. So that's a group with a different set of problems that we also need to address. And then finally, this is the set of numbers by the starting institution that people go to. Their first, people do transfers sometimes. Sandy will talk about transfers. But where they start. So, and so these are real completion rates. Conditional on starting at a community college, do you get an associate degree or transfer to get a bachelor's degree? The bottom four rows are different kinds of four-year institutions. Public, the first two are public, the bottom two are private, and then whether or not they are doctorate-granting institutions as a measure of, are they a research university or not? Well, just within those four-year institutions, the variance is very high, right? If you go to a public, non-doctorate-granting institution, completion rates are less than half, whereas at the best group, the doctorate-granting privates, the probability of completing is 3/4. And then if you look at the most elite schools, those are over 90%. And if you look at the lowest tier public schools, they're going to be considerably below 47%. So even within the four-year schools, there's a lot of variation. But then when you get to the public 2 years, the community colleges, that's the third row up there, the for-profit schools, where a lot of disadvantaged students go these days, are the second row, the numbers are actually much worse than any of the 4 years, right? So for community colleges, a lot of students do transfer. About 12% of the total sample will end up with a BA. In some recent data, it's as high as 14%, but it's in that range. Only about 14% actually get an AA, so only a quarter of the students who start at community college get a degree. And if you add in certificates, that goes up to 35%, a third rather than a quarter. At the for-profits, much fewer people get degrees, a lot more of them get certificates. So the outcomes overall for both groups are not very good. And here's the real punchline. Low-income students, disadvantaged students, first-generation students are heavily concentrated at those institutions with the weak outcomes. At the for-profits, because they market that group heavily at the public 2 years, and at the lowest tier of public 4 years. So these students are going to places which have bad track records. Now, again, at this point, it's natural to say, well, is it the characteristics that the students bring, or is it the institutions? And some very good research has been done on this by John Bound and his co-authors and other folks. It really suggests it's a mix of the two. Anyone with a given level of achievement, when they go to a better institution, their outcomes are generally better. And part of the problem is even high-achieving students, not that there's so many of them in the low-income group, but some, they often go to these bad institutions as well, simply because they have very little information and little access to the better places. So it's partly about the students and partly about the institutions. Then let's get to the second question of our three. What are students studying, and are they taking things that have market value when they finish and go back in the labor market? So this is from our national data, what students are studying at public community colleges. So first of all, you can see that over on the left-hand side, about a quarter never declare a major. Maybe they're not making enough progress there to declare a major. The third bar, humanities and social sciences, is another group for which there's not a lot of that. If that's what you bring to the market as a completed terminal associate degree, there's not a lot of demand there. And this other group are a pretty mixed category as well. So if you add together those three groups, over 40% of students at community colleges either don't have a major or aren't majoring in something that the market seems to value. Now, different states do this differently. And I have data, I've studied data from Florida a lot. In Florida, everybody is pushed to pick a major fairly quickly. And what you see there is almost nobody is undeclared, but huge numbers of people in these humanities, like liberal studies and general studies. And not a lot of value there when you go to the market. So these are the data from the labor market within the first 5 years. And these numbers are from linear regressions that control for achievement and all that kind of stuff. So they really are pretty close to a market return. Well, people with graduate degrees in the far left, people with BAs, those numbers, and those are roughly percent increases relative to high school graduates in the first 5 years. No big surprises there. I think the three sub-BA categories I think are a little bit surprising. Number one, notice that this fourth column, associates in science or associates in applied science, the return to that is double the return to an associate in arts. So right away, there's huge variation in the associate degrees, and the more technical ones are much better. Associates in arts, on average, in Florida, just give you a return of what the average certificate gives you. Now, again, in Florida, a lot of the certificates are credit-based, but on average, that's as good an investment. And then when you look within that AA category, as we've done, even there's a lot of variation. The occupational AAs in business and things like that have a bigger return, but having a terminal degree in humanities, an AA in humanities, like liberal studies, generates almost no market return at all. And of course, that's where we see large numbers of people end up. So bottom line, out of these two, a lot of students aren't finishing, especially disadvantaged students, and a lot of them are studying things that the market tends to not reward.
So one of the problems that may explain a significant amount of why students are not completing or why it takes them a long time to complete has to do with finances. And finances on the student level, in addition to the institutional level. So we talk a lot about tuition prices, but for the students at community colleges that we're talking about, tuition is not really the main issue, because these disadvantaged students, if you come from a low-income background or you're a low-income adult, your federal and state grant aid are quite likely to cover the tuition, even if you're not in one of these free tuition zones, cover the tuition at the community college. But that doesn't mean you don't have a lot of other expenses that you have to cover, and if you have to work full-time, that's a problem. Now, the sort of disturbing number of these disadvantaged students are enrolling in for-profit institutions, and the tuition at for-profit institutions is about, more than 3 times, 4 times as high as the tuition at community colleges. So for those students, actually, tuition is a significant problem, and those students accumulate much more debt than students who go to community colleges, although debt in community colleges is also increasing. Other problems are not so much about how generous is the student aid system, but for example, the complexity of the student aid system and the difficulty that students have accessing the system is really significant. And I know community colleges are working on this, but at for-profit institutions, they all apply for financial aid. And at community colleges, a significant number of people who would be eligible for federal grants are not even applying. But the biggest cost, of course, of going to college, particularly a community college, is the opportunity cost of your time. That students, even if you don't borrow, to suggest that borrowing money is the only problem with paying for college is just wrong, because you've put time and energy and you've got foregone earnings and foregone opportunities that you could have pursued if you had not been in college. So if all you did was throw away 3 years of your life and not graduate, that's still a big problem. But the longer the time you spend, the higher that cost is. So time to completion becomes very important. And we know that not everyone can enroll for full-time, but students who are always part-time have really, really low completion rates. So the completion rates that you see up there mix the full-time and the part-time, and the gap is really, really large. So student debt for associate degree holders is very different. Most of the conversation about student debt is bachelor's degree recipients, and these are the people who seem to generate the most public sympathy. But actually, the people we should be worried about are the population we're talking about now. People from disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have a fallback if they have trouble repaying their loans, and people who are at risk of either not completing or earning degrees with little labor market value. So this is a chart that just shows you what has happened over time to the debt levels of associate degree recipients. Now, these are the people who complete their associate degrees. And if you look at the bottom 3 rows, that's all associate degree recipients. You can see that that the percentage who managed not to borrow was 63% in 2003-04 and had fallen to 50% by 2011-12. And at the other end of those rows, the percentage who graduated with $30,000 or more in debt was only 1% in 2003-04 and had climbed significantly to still the low rate of 8% in 2011-12. But if you look at the 2 sections of the table, the top section is for-profit institutions and the second section is public 2-year institutions. And you can see that not the whole story, but a significant part of the story of what's driving this has to do with the switch in where these degrees come from. So in 2003-04, 7% of them came from the for-profit sector, and by 2011-12, that was 14%. And there, 28% of the associate degree recipients had borrowed $30,000 or more, whereas there were virtually none of those either in 2003-04. So there was an increase in community colleges from 1% to 4%. That's obviously, in percentage terms, a big increase, but it's not the big part of the story. So, and if you look at default rates on loans, the default rate is actually higher, somewhat higher for community college students than for for-profit students. But again, so it's a problem. I don't want to suggest it's not a problem, but it represents a much smaller share of the community college students than it does of the for-profit students. So we want to think about these students and, you know, what is causing the problems that are leading to these outcomes that are not satisfactory. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the student circumstances, and then Harry is going to talk about the institutions. And it's obviously a combination of factors, and we talk a lot in detail in the book about this, but you know, part of the issue is clearly low levels of high school achievement and academic preparation. We're not going to solve this problem without doing something about what goes on before students get to college, what goes on in early childhood, what goes on in K-12. Even controlling for academic achievement, the outcomes are still very different by income levels. So this is not the whole story, but it is a very important part of the story. Financial barriers obviously make a big difference, but again, the financial barriers are not going to be solved by just doing away with tuition, because at a community college, about 20% of your budget is your tuition and fees, even before you get financial aid. So figuring out how people can successfully live and work at the same time is a huge barrier that we have to figure out how to overcome. Another big issue is, like, why are these students choosing to go to institutions that aren't going to serve them well, or to major in fields that aren't going to serve them well? And a huge part of the problem is that they don't have the information. They don't have access. They don't have information. They don't have options. They don't have resources. They don't have what we call social capital. They don't have parents at home who went to college and can tell them. They don't have parents who have been terrifically successful in the labor market, or they wouldn't be from such low-income families. And we don't help them very much before they make their choices, and we don't help them very much as they are making choices along the way. And recognizing that we can't just hand people money, that we have to give them strong supports is a critical part of solving this problem. And we just see that students are enrolling in institutions where, in many cases, you could predict that this is not going to work out well. For some of them, it's not the right time to enroll. For some of them, it's the wrong institution. For some of them, it's just the wrong program. But in many cases, we could predict, and those are the easiest problems to solve. We should be able to solve that problem. We can't predict everything that's going to happen to people, all the life events that are going to intervene while they are trying to complete their degrees. But we really want to, it's really important to focus on both the financial barriers and the barriers that have accumulated before college and that people experience while they are in college. One of the really, I think, most complicated issues is the transfer issue. So as Harry mentioned, we've 12 to 14% of these students who start at community colleges end up managing to get bachelor's degrees. If you ask them when they enroll, about 80% say they're planning to transfer and go to a four-year institution. So those plans never actually materialize, and they don't succeed in doing that. So this creates a huge problem, because then they end up with, if they're lucky, an associate degree that has little labor market value, right? And so when they start out, you know, we really want people to keep all the doors open. We don't want to say to people, chances are it's not going to work out that way. You should make sure along the way that you get a credential that will have value even if you don't manage to transfer and earn a bachelor's degree. And we hesitate to say those things, but the two paths can be conflicting, because if you're looking for the credits that will transfer best, you're going to want the credits that you would get in a general program in a four-year college. But if you do that, then you're not going to be prepared. So we have to figure out how to acknowledge the reality that most of these students are not going to transfer and earn bachelor's degrees. And we have to prepare them for the labor market, balancing their short-term and long-term opportunities. And let me just say that we are not saying we don't value the humanities and social sciences. I get very worried about people saying the only reason people should go to college is to get a job. Of course not. But we must make sure that these people, in addition to getting a general strong education that will serve them well over time, are prepared quickly to make some money, because otherwise they're never going to be able to realize their aspirations.
So Sandy talked about some of the difficulties that the students bring to higher ed.
I just have to tell you, I just put up a slide that's still part of what I was talking about.
Oh, okay.
So you're not that.
There. So I want to talk a little about the institutions. And as we said, the institutions at which the disadvantaged students are pretty highly concentrated. The first four bullet points have to do with the public community colleges. And it comes down to too few resources, but too few incentives to spend the resources well, too little guidance, too little structure, sort of channeling them and helping them make the transitions they need to make. So just a word on each of them. Community colleges get too few resources, especially given that their student body is so disadvantaged and so in need of services. Quick slide here. This is sort of the different sources of revenue per full-time student equivalent at different years. So the second and the third columns are the public resources for students at the public 4 years and the 2 years. Total revenues, the fourth column, and then revenues from state and local are the fifth column. So really two stories here. Number one, over time at both levels, the revenues are declining. The public revenues are declining at both the state level and at the federal level, and there's a story about why that's going on. But the other story that we want to emphasize here is if you compare the levels for public 2 year to public 4 year, the levels of aid at the public 2 years are much lower. If you add together the second and third column for total public resources, you get, bottom row, about $6,500 for 2 year students and about $14,000 per student in the 4 years, more than double. Now you might say, well, of course, those are research institutions with much higher expenses. A lot of them are not research institutions. A lot of them are the lower tier schools, and yet they get many, many more resources per student. So too few resources is definitely a problem. However, the incentives to spend the money well are also very weak. Remember, the subsidies and the tuition levels that schools get, they get them regardless of whether students complete anything and regardless of whether there's any market value when they complete something. So the incentives, so there's no reward for trying to do a better job, either on completion or labor market. And if anything, the costs of going the labor market route are higher because a lot of these more technical programs that we see the labor market does reward, they're much more expensive. Equipment costs are very high. Instructor costs are often very high. And again, instructors on the staff either don't want to teach that stuff or aren't equipped up to date. So you have to hire adjuncts from industry, engineers from Ford to teach machining, et cetera. And that all adds to the costs. Then the students get very little guidance, very little academic guidance or career guidance, and very little structure to the institution. Tom Bailey at Columbia, who's one of the premier community college scholars in the country, he and a couple of co-authors wrote a book a few years ago called Redesigning Community Colleges. And their punchline was there's so little structure. And they compare it to a cafeteria, where a student grabs a tray and kind of wanders aimlessly grabbing stuff off the shelf, which also does not help them make good choices and help them make the transitions. So all of those are problems with the public schools. And on the for-profit side, you have a whole different set of issues. And on the for-profit side, as Sandy said, the costs are much higher, students pile up much more debt, and if anything, the outcomes are worse. The completion rates are lower, what they get has much less value. So overall, the for-profits also need attention. There's a different set of issues there. Time is running low, so we're going to get to our solutions right now. And again, I'm going to talk about the institutional solutions, and Sandy will then come back to supports aimed at students. So there are some very positive models that are at least promising, if not proven. And one of them is called sector-based training. And that's really what's often called the workforce programs. It's more on the certificate side than the degree side, although in many places the certificates can now stack to associate degrees. There's a lot of good, rigorous studies with random assignment models showing that the sector-based programs can be very successful and have very good impacts. In the whole job training literature, that's the most successful stuff. Now the challenge is replicating those really good models and scaling them around the country. The other model on which there's less evidence, the guided pathway models, comes out of Tom Bailey's work. And this is an idea of building more structure and more guidance so people can make better choices as they advance. Well, what's it going to take to expand those two models in community colleges around the country, or even the lower tier 4 years? Number one, they need more resources. But number two, they need better incentives. If we provide more resources, I would target them very carefully on expanding teaching capacity in the high demand fields or the services that Sandy will talk about that help students get there. And I would strengthen the incentives. External accountability is often provided by the states. It's called outcomes-based funding or performance-based funding. A lot of states are moving in that direction, but you could do it badly and create a lot of unintended consequences. We would like to see those incentives be based on subsequent student earnings, not just on completion rates or credit attainment. And subsequent earnings for the students we care about the most, the disadvantaged students, the first-generation students. So these places would be rewarded for taking care of these students who need the most help. And internal funding can also improve the incentives, like letting the high-demand places keep more of their revenue within the institution, and that will create incentives to sort of to meet the market test as well. One more thing, on the for-profits, we think the regulation is very important. And there's actually a very good policy brief that came out of Brookings about a month ago by Stephanie Cellini and a bunch of her co-authors making the case that the regs implemented during the Obama years are really important in the for-profit sector to keep from having these terrible outcomes. But of course, politically, that's a powerful sector. It's hard to keep them. Then there's a whole bunch of other innovations in higher ed, MOOCs, competency-based credentials. There we just need more evidence on what the evidence to date on MOOCs is not very promising. We need more experimentation of these innovations and more evaluation. One more thing, and then I hand it back to Sandy. We think there has to be more.
We're done.
Oh, we're done. Okay.
Really quick.
Okay, really quick. More alternative pathways starting in high school for the students who either aren't ready for college or aren't inclined. A wider set of strong pathways, work-based learning, apprenticeships, et cetera, are important.
Okay, so I will not go into solutions because I know we don't have any more time, but let me just reiterate that in terms of what we need to do for students, they need more money, but they need so much more than more money. So we need to reform the student aid system, but we need to focus really on the services and the guidance that we give them. Broadly, what we want to say is there's not going to be one solution. We need a lot of solutions. We need a big dose of realism. We need to meet students where they are. We need to recognize that not all doors are still open to people by the time they get to college, and we need to help them have the best outcomes possible given their current circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you.